Hello, this is Jay DeMarco with Rutland Plastic Technologies, coming to you from the Regional Supply Headquarters here in Salt Lake City, Utah. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about why there are so many white inks in the screen print business. I want to point out here on this main page that I have included my email address. If you'd like to email me with any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to reply. In fact, I enjoy interacting with customers and answering questions and supporting them. So jot down that email address, jdemarco@rutlandinc.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about myself. I feel like it's important to sort of validate the presenter in these types of webinars, to give you a little bit of my background and experience. I've been at Rutland Plastics for about 6 years. Prior to working at Rutland Plastics, I worked in the screen print business in a production environment. So roughly 22 years I've worked in our business. I started in a little more than a garage shop that a friend of mine owned, and we were able to grow that business to what was a 32 automatic operation. We had 3 facilities that ran in North America and Central America. That opportunity exposed me to a lot of different processes in our business. I learned how to screen print by starting in the entry-level position that we know well as cleaning the screens. Once I advanced from cleaning screens, I moved up to manual printing, automated printing, pre-press management, screen department management, and virtually worked in every role in the screen print process. One opportunity working in a large screen print shop that I was given was exposure to lots of different applications. So I've been able to work through the high densities, flocking, gels, puffs, you name it. I've probably had my hands on it at some point in my career. So it gives me sort of a broad perspective on inks and applications, and I like to be able to present information from one printer to another. I think that's a pretty helpful position to take. This seminar came out of travels. My role here at Rutland Plastics, where I manage our dealers throughout North America, is that I go out and see customers on a weekly basis. I'm in front of customers typically anywhere between 4 to 7 a day, out discussing our products, promoting our products, supporting our dealer. And a question that comes up quite regularly is related to white ink. Often customers come to me and ask, why are there so many white ink options? And at times they get confused on what white ink to apply to different substrates. With the complexity of substrates that we see today, those substrates are blended with different types of fabrics. I think today tri-blends are ones that are a very popular concern in the market. I like to be able to address and clarify when and why and how you add a white ink to a substrate. So today's seminar, my goal is to help sort of clear up some of those ideas and help you understand when and where to apply a white ink and how to choose the right white ink for your application. Typically, customers who are considering white ink have a variety of reasons why they may choose a particular white ink. A lot of times, the choice is made primarily on price. Customers are very price sensitive. White ink, as we all know, is typically up to half of your Plastisol purchases that you'll make annually. So it's a big buy for a lot of shops. Therefore, there's a lot of focus driven on price. So price is absolutely probably one of the leading reasons generally why people buy white ink. Secondarily, people will look at printability. At times, people buy white ink because it's the same white ink they've been buying for years, and they just haven't experimented with other products. They're comfortable with that white ink. It works well in their process, and and they've been applying it that way for many years. So for them to make a change is a bit of an uncomfortable idea or concept. Other reasons why people use a particular white ink is that they may have a guy from a new hire in from another print shop or a friend in the business who's recommended a white ink that work well for them. We also see people look at brightness or how white a white may be. At times, it's quite frankly just they like the salesperson representing a particular brand of product or a particular line, and they like to buy from that guy. And then finally, probably product availability. Customers like to buy a white ink that they know are readily available, probably at a maximum 1 day away. For some who are fortunate to have a dealer in town, maybe just a few miles drive to be able to access that product. So that's some of the reasons why customers may choose a particular white ink. I'd like to present to you maybe some of the reasons why you should, or additional reasons why you should buy a white ink, and these would be qualifiers. This is what I perceive as the questions that you should be asking to understand which white ink you should select. These qualifiers are, first, the content of the fabric. It's important to know before you start applying the white ink to your substrate or your shirt exactly what the fabric content is. Typically that can be found in the care and content label. The next qualifier that I'd like to point out to you is what finish would you like? Are you looking for a matte finish or a gloss finish? Hand of the product is important. Are you looking for a soft hand? Are you looking for a more durable film deposit? Consider what kind of equipment you use. Is the equipment that you use, are you manually printing or automated printing? Will you be using the white to be a standalone color, or will you be using the white as an underbase? And finally, screen specifics. I'll get into each one of these topics individually so we can discuss them. First, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the types of white inks available to choose. This webinar, I'm specifically targeting Plastisol inks, so I won't spend much time on discharge. The types of white inks that are available to you are cotton white, low bleed white, polyester, and a nylon white. So a little bit about each of these whites. Cotton whites are designed for cotton substrates. The characteristics of a cotton white is that they're smooth and creamy. They typically have the ability to run through high mesh counts. It's important to know that they have no bleed resistance. So anytime there's polyester present, you cannot use a cotton white ink. Personally, I'm a huge fan of cotton white inks. Cotton white inks give you a much smoother surface to print on than a low bleed ink. And I've got a slide here in a minute I'm going to show you. It exaggerates it, but it does explain a little bit. Next is a low bleed ink, or what we would call a 50-50 ink. And those inks are probably the most popular white inks used in our business. Typically what we find in the field is that shops don't want to manage more than one white. They want what I refer to as a silver bullet in a can. They have one white ink for all applications to make it easy on them. I don't support that idea, but I do understand it coming from a production environment, especially as you're adding personnel and presses to the mix. It becomes much more complicated to manage white ink application on different substrates. Low bleed inks or 50-50 inks are designed for garments that have polyester present. Generally speaking, a low bleed ink will have a heavier body than a cotton white ink. Also, generally, they will need to run through lower mesh counts, but they do have bleed resistance. So applying and blocking dye migration on that 50-50 garment is something that they do have the ability to do. The next white we'll discuss here is just polyester whites. These are whites designed for 100% polyester substrates. We're typically talking about an athletic garment. As you move up the scale in bleed resistance of ink, you tend to get a thicker ink product. So a polyester ink will be heavier than a low bleed ink. A low bleed ink will be heavier than a cotton white ink. Typically with a polyester ink, you need a low mesh count. We're talking about an 86 through a 110 mesh. But a polyester ink will provide you the best bleed resistance. Finally, nylon white ink. Nylon white inks are made for nylon fabrics. You can apply them to lycra, spandex as well. Nylon inks are smooth and creamy. They're generally designed for a glossy finish. That glossy finish and durability of nylon inks give them what we call scuff resistance. And that's important for true on-field applications where these nylon jerseys or activewear may be decorated for real use in sporting events. Nylon inks are generally a lower cure product. You do want to apply them through a lower mesh, somewhere in the 110 to 160 range. And nylon inks offer no bleed resistance, and it's important to note there because I do get questions at times. People will ask, can they apply a nylon ink to a polyester garment because they like the gloss finish and are interested in that finish on a polyester garment. Generally speaking, and I'm going out on a limb here a bit, but generally speaking, if you apply the right white ink to the substrate as an underlay, meaning that where ink meets fabric, you've applied the right chemistry, it's less critical to have the same series ink in color on top. And what I mean by that is if hypothetically we were printing on a nylon garment and we were to apply a nylon white, I commonly get the question, do I need to have a nylon color on top of that nylon white? My response is to match the same sheen, gloss, scuff resistance, the answer is yes. But from a bonding standpoint, you can apply a utility color on top of a nylon white and still have a good usable product. One other thing that I want to mention here is about dye migration. Dye migration is a problem that occurs when you coat a polyester fabric or a fabric containing polyester. You coat it with plastic, which is what plastisol ink is. You heat that garment to cure the ink. The polyester threads release a gas, and that gas is then trapped in the layer of plastisol that you applied and discolors it. So when we talk about bleed resistance and low bleed chemistry, what we're talking about are inks that are designed to suppress those dyes from coming through the ink film that you applied. What I have here is an example of a cotton white garment on a very coarse cotton fabric. We'll talk about the benefits of cotton white here in a future slide, but what I'd like to point out to you is cotton whites generally have a very good fiber matting property, which is shown in this slide. They're able to mat those fibers down to work towards achieving a smoother finish than some of the other products that you have as options. Part of the reason is the hand of those products, which are much creamier and smoother, tend to react better in the screen print application for fiber mat down than a tackier, heavier bodied ink that may lift fibers up as it's releasing from the mesh. Next, this is an exaggerated surface of a 50/50 or low bleed ink. I wanted to point out this exaggerated photo to you because I want you to see the difference between the surface of a low bleed ink compared to the surface of a cotton ink. So if I flash back quickly here, here's your cotton ink surface, which has got the fibers matted down and it's smooth. Low bleed inks generally do not have as smooth a finish as a cotton white ink. So if we're comparing surfaces to print on, without question, a cotton surface is a cotton white ink surface is a better surface to apply color. At times I get questions about why customers may see fisheye, pitting, unsmooth finishes on their garments. or even harsher hand. And what I point to is almost commonly a low bleed ink being applied to a cotton garment. And in many examples, I'm able to show customers that if they would revert to a cotton ink on a cotton substrate, the problems that they are experiencing will disappear because the cotton white ink will just give you a smoother base to print on. Next, this garment could be nylon, could be poly. Just an example of how these products will apply to a garment. Know that both nylon and polyester substrates don't absorb ink like a cotton or a 50-50 garment would. So these inks tend to lay on the surface of the substrate as opposed to diving into the fabrics. So we're going to talk a little bit about the first subtopic from the earlier slide, and that's qualifying the substrate. It's important to qualify the substrate, for you to know what that fabric content is before you apply ink to it. And it's simply by checking the care and content label of the garment. If there's no polyester present, then I recommend on a t-shirt to apply a cotton ink. It's sufficient for that application. At times, if you're applying ink to a lycra spandex nylon, one of those fabrics, I would encourage you to consider a stretch additive, and we make a stretch additive available through Rutland Plastics. You can add to your ink somewhere in the 15 to 30% range, which will give that ink more stretch. And we also make a stretch white ink. If you have a true application where you need a lot of elongation, a lot of stretch, you can purchase a product from Rutland. That's in the Spandasol series of inks. Again, nylon, lycra, spandex are what we consider color fast. So looking at that care and content label, if it's a nylon, lycra, spandex combination, those do not bleed when they're heated. Therefore, you have the option of applying a nylon ink or a cotton ink with a stretch additive. If you see the presence of polyester in any amount on the care and content label, it's the game changer. Quite frankly, the presence of polyester is what gives you and I the most difficult experience in cure and quality when we're attempting to apply whiting to a dark garment. Also, it's important to note that garments that were PFDs or prepared for dye that have been over-dyed, I've seen many cases where those garments will also release dye or stain or migrate during the heat process. So it's possible that even on a 100% cotton garment that's been over-dyed, you may require a bleed-resistant ink. I use a general rule. If the garment is less than 51% polyester, so I would apply just a low bleed 50-50 ink. If the garment has 50% or more polyester content, then I would move to a true 100% polyester ink, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. So less than 50% or 51% polyester present, a low bleed 50-50 ink like Rutland Snap White should be sufficient. More than 50% polyester, I just move forward to a polyester garment, or polyester ink, I'm sorry. Rutland Super Poly is the product I would recommend there. And when we get to the end of this presentation, I've got a bunch of product codes referenced for you. The next subtopic in choosing a white is the finish of the ink. Know that inks have different finishes, from matte to more of a satin look, all the way up to a high sheen or a gloss look. The industry generally has moved to a matte finish. So if the inks you use today have a high gloss to them or glossy ink products, know that the industry really has shied away from high gloss products and has pushed most of our ink products towards more of a matte finish or a flat finish. You're going to see 50-50 and polyester inks, due to the chemistry, those are going to have a matte finish. Nylon inks will have the highest gloss finish. Cotton whites are typically available in matte, semi-gloss, or a gloss finish. So maybe you take a look at what your ink is and determine if that finish is what your customers are looking for. It's important to note here that with Plastisol, the hotter it's heated, the glossier it can get. So if the ink has the ability to get glossy based on the chemistry and the resins used, the hotter you get it, the glossier it can become. So if your ink today has a lot of gloss to it, you may be able to minimize some of your oven temperature and mitigate some of that gloss. Hand feel, when you're qualifying a white, it's important to know what kind of hand feel you're looking to achieve. A lot of our customers today are looking for a softer hand feel. And the goal is, how do you get a softer hand feel and still get a vibrant white ink? My answer is almost always the same when we're talking about a Plastisol application, and that is consider using a cotton white ink. You're going to hear that theme throughout this presentation. Again, I'm just a big fan of using a cotton white ink on a cotton substrate. It just makes sense. Cotton white inks typically will give you a softer hand feel than a 50-50 ink will. So I assert to you today that if you take your 50-50 ink that you use as your utility product on all substrates and replace it with a cotton white ink and did a side-by-side comparison, you could see a noticeable difference in suppleness of that ink product on the surface, that the cotton white ink is softer. So you can still have a softer product and have good opacity. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll point out to it again. The stronger the bleed resistance in an ink, typically the stiffer the hand, and that's tied to the chemistry. Customers ask me about soft hand feel on polyester substrates, such as Under Armour or moisture wicking type of substrates. It's really a challenge to achieve a soft hand feel on those fabrics. Rutland has engineered an ink system named Endurance Ink System. You can email me to learn a little bit more about it. That ink system is a two-part. It has a clear and a white that's applied on top, and it has bleed resistance and has more of a soft, supple feel with a minimal amount of stretch. But generally speaking, soft hand feel on 100% polyester is really difficult. I even noted here, virtually impossible to achieve. Also, recall that I mentioned that polyester substrates, they don't absorb ink. So the ink's going to be on the surface. Therefore, there's going to be hand. The ultimate softness for underlay is discharge. Again, I'm not planning to get into discharge in this process, but I'm happy to explore the option of discharge with you, either through here, Rob at Regional Supply, or contacting me via email. We can talk you through the discharge process. But if you're on a 100% cotton garment and you're not achieving a soft enough hand feel for your customer with a cotton white ink, then we should probably discuss the option of discharge. What kind of equipment do you use? We don't necessarily design white inks for manual or automated equipment. We design white inks for opacity, creaminess, hand, non-phthalate chemistry, but we generally don't have a manual printer or automated printer in mind. The ultimate goal, the holy grail for us, would be to design that white ink that works for everyone's application. But there are so many different nuances in our business that it is a challenge to come up with that one utility white that everyone loves. Again, cotton white inks generally suited well for both manual and automated printer because of that chemistry, because they're smooth and creamy. Typically a cotton white ink will release from the mesh well. It prints smoothly. It's just an easier product to print than some low bleed chemistries. Low bleed chemistry, which are probably the bulk of what people are purchasing. They're putting these 50-50 inks on all substrates. There's a bunch of different viscosity options that we manufacture. There are a bunch of different opacity options, bleed-resistant options, and those are all sort of specific to chemistry and industry demand and customer demand. Typically, the heavier low-bleed inks are being used by automated printers, and the thinner or creamier low-bleed 50/50 inks are being requested by manual printers. It's important to note here when you're printing a low-bleed ink, releasing the ink from the mesh is what gives you a smooth print. Commonly, I am questioned about customers who can't achieve a smooth underbase, and they struggle to get that smooth underbase. And most of the time, the culprit in that complaint is that the ink is hanging up in the mesh. So as you take your squeegee and it passes through the screen mesh itself, if you were to lift the screen up and look back through it, you would see ink hanging or clinging to parts of the mesh that create pits or pockets. Once you flash that ink in place without smoothing it out and getting full release, it's impossible to fix that. So you will have a rough surface all the way through the process. I like to point out that there are options in squeegee durometer. You note at the bottom of the screen there, a 60-90-60 is a squeegee durometer that I like, which gives you a 60 durometer on the outside, a 90 in the middle, so it's very firm and not very flexible, and then a 60 on the reverse side, so that piece of squeegee rubber can be spun from side to side for wear purposes. Know that the harder your squeegee is, the less ink you're going to apply. The reverse is true. A softer squeegee will apply more ink. With angle, I call 0 degrees sort of straight up and down, or you could maybe refer to it as 90, but straight up and down is less ink deposit. 15 degrees will deposit more ink. I like running somewhere between 0 and 15, maybe somewhere in the 5 to 10 degree range with a 60-90-60, which really does apply a nice coat of ink. So now we're going to ask, how will the white ink be used? Different white inks are recommended for different applications. I referenced earlier when we're looking for one white ink for one color to apply to a garment. That application, typically you'd run through a 110 mesh. You're looking for probably a heavier bodied ink, or a thicker ink would give you more opacity as you're applying through that 110 mesh. So if my shop does a lot of, we do a lot of bright white on dark garments, some one color stuff, what am I looking for? The answer is probably a heavier bodied ink, a thicker ink through a 110 mesh. If you're using white as underbases or as a highlight, then I typically look for a more creamier ink, an ink that I can run through a 156 to 200 mesh count. It's important to note that white inks have mesh count ratings, and you should know what your mesh count rating is on your white. Because of the particle size in white inks, your white ink may or may not be able to run through a 156 to 200 mesh count or a 230 to 280 mesh count. So look at the technical data sheet applied for your white ink and understand its limitations. I often get questioned, how is high-end screen printing done where whites are printed through a high mesh? How do those customers achieve opacity? And the opacity there, a couple of things. First is you qualify the white ink. Ensure that you have a white ink that will pass through those 230 to 280 mesh counts. The other is screen tension. The higher the tension you have available to you, typically the more the ink will lay on top of the fabric and the more opaque print you will achieve. Fiber mat down is important with white ink. If the shirts that you're printing have a lot of fibers on them, they're ring spun type cotton, there are whites designed for and engineered for fiber mat down, or that may do a better job of fiber mat down. Again, a cotton white generally does a better job of fiber mat down because it's not as sticky or tacky, so when it releases from the mesh, you lift your screen up, you aren't getting any type of pull back or lift off of the ink. Know that the thinner the plastisol is, sometimes I find customers migrate to what prints easier when it comes to white ink. So they'll migrate towards a thinner white ink, yet when they try to get a vibrant white, they are struggle to get a vibrant white. What we call grin through, which is you apply a white layer down and you flash it and then you look at it, how much of the percentage of substrate can you see through that first layer of white, we refer to as grin through. So the thinner the white ink, the more grin through you're going to have. So if you're selecting a white ink because it flies through the screen, it's super easy to print, most likely you have a challenge getting a vibrant print as a one color through a 110 mesh on a dark underlay, because that ink is actually absorbing into the fabric rather than lying on top because of the viscosity of that product. To talk a little bit about screen specifics, I've ran into customers who are absolutely shocked when I tell them that their coating practice is the reason why my white ink may have failed in their facility. Know that there is a direct correlation between the emulsion stencil thickness that you apply and how well our white ink can perform on their substrate. If your application of emulsion or stencil is a thin coat or an application that has very little stencil on the back of the screen, it's very challenging to get a proper application of white ink. If you think about it, the emulsion that you apply is a gasket. That gasket is a regulator. It is what is in between the screen mesh and the surface of your garment. So it's gauging how much white ink you can apply to that garment. So the thicker the emulsion stencil, the more ink I can deposit in a single pass. The reverse is true. If you have a very thin stencil, you will have a very thin layer of white ink applied. So you should look at your stencil thickness and your coating practice to see if you can improve your stencil thickness. It's important to note that thinner emulsions make it challenging to get a proper stencil thickness. So customers who are purchasing emulsion on price, they're buying a less expensive emulsion, which is more than likely has a less solid count, therefore will be a thinner product and have less stencil thickness. So in fact, your coating or your stencil or your emulsion purchase has a direct relationship to how my white ink may perform on your substrate. It's also important to note the percent open area of the mesh you purchase. And for some of you, you've maybe never heard that before. On screen mesh that you purchase, there is a rating of the percent open area. And that percent open area will vary depending on the actual size of the thread used to weave that mesh. The percent open area, even within 110 mesh, can vary significantly depending on the mesh manufacturer and that thread micron size. Take a little bit of time to research percent open areas and understand what your mesh is offering you in percent open area. You may find an alternative to your 110 mesh that you're using today that has more open area. The higher percentage of open area, the more ink can pass through. So if we were to combine all three of these points here, which would be a proper coated stencil, a large percent open area, and high screen tension, you could apply a much more opaque print than you could with less tension, small percentage open area, and a light coated stencil. So these are all variables that you have to consider, that I consider when I'm out in shops trying to improve performance of our ink and improve the quality of a customer's application. Screen tension is one that really should be a no-brainer for you, but for some they're challenged. I'm not necessarily referring to a roller frame. What I'm referring to is a screen that has a measurable screen tension. I like something 20 newtons or more. There are Newton meters that are available to be purchased, and you could measure the newtons of your screens. But it's important to note that tension has everything to do with release of mesh. Tension has to do with how square that mesh opening may be. A lack of tension will create sort of an oblong mesh opening that makes it difficult for ink to release. So a nice tight screen which gives you a good tension, good pressure, the ability to apply steady pressure across, even pressure across that screen, really does help with a smooth application and release of the ink. So I do challenge you to take a look at screen tension and question whether or not you should improve your practices there as it relates to screen tension. Here are the products that I'm recommending that you use in the Rutland ink line. Again, our cotton white ink, real simply called cotton white. We had several other cotton whites through the years, but most of the cotton white we sell anymore is EH9072 cotton white. EH9072 is a stellar performer for our company. It is a premium product at a very competitive price. It's sort of a utility white. I would recommend this to be the white that you buy for your general applications on cotton substrates. It's a great product and it's priced very well. Next, if we're talking about low bleed white recommendations, EL9240, which is Snap White, which is our top selling white. Again, it's a utility product, great product. I only like using it on substrates where polyester is present, on where you need low bleed or bleed resistance on 50/50 garments. Next is the EL9073, which is our Street Fighter White product. It's, again, it does have bleed resistance. It is an economy price product. Finally, EL9330, which is a new product for us. That is our best fiber matte down product in a low bleed. I did neglect here, there is a EH9331 cotton version of our Tidy White that is available. EH9331 is also a fiber matte down cotton white. Under polyester whites, these would be for 100% polyester substrates. EL9746, which is our Super Poly White. Super Poly White, I did a lot of testing personally in our lab against competitors' products, and I would challenge you to find a better 100% polyester white in bleed resistance. It has remarkable bleed resistance. It has very good ease of print characteristics. It's a smooth product. It's much creamier than some of the other polyester whites that we've even marketed in the past. It's just a great product. It's a real win in technology for our company and has been a huge success story. That is EL9746 Super Poly White. Finally, nylon white, EN9036, which is referred to also as American white. That's a glossy white with scuff resistance and low cure properties. In conclusion here, why does it matter? Why does it matter that you apply a cotton white on a cotton garment, a 50/50 white on a 50/50 garment? Does it really make a difference? So I've just wanted to reference a few of the negatives here of using the wrong ink on a substrate. Putting a cotton white on a 50/50, which is probably what most of you fear, which is why you buy a 50/50 ink for your cotton applications, is because cotton white ink has no bleed resistance. So if someone makes a mistake and applies that cotton white ink to a 50/50 substrate, you've got a failed garment that you have to reprint, and there's a lot of cost tied to it. Again, coming from production, I understand it. Putting a 50/50 ink on a cotton garment has the probability, most 50/50 inks, ours, our competitors, generally anything on the market, there are a few exceptions out there, but very few, applying a low bleed ink to a cotton garment can produce what we call ghosting. Ghosting is when the shirt has exited the dryer, you have a stack of shirts that you're stacking up in your collection area, you fold those shirts up in a stack of 12, a couple of days later you came back and found a haze or an image of the white ink you applied either on the back of the shirt that was laying on top of that image or inside of the shirt where the dye has been removed from the garment. And that's a chemical reaction that happens that low bleed inks, again, most low bleed inks, it can occur when all of the elements are right, which it requires heat and humidity and time. But low bleed inks, 50-50 inks on cotton garments can ghost, and ghosting is not something you can repair or fix. I typically have seen ghosting in pastel shades, somewhere in the middle shading of like stone or sand or blue spruce or some of those medium pastel-y shades. Those tend to ghost the worst, but trust me when I tell you I've seen ghosting on black and navy as well. So it's a risky proposition that if you're applying that low bleed 50-50 ink to a cotton tee. Also, it's a harsher hand. There's no argument there that a 50-50 ink is less flexible than a cotton white ink. It's not as supple, and it just hand feel wise, from a feel, you can tell the difference between a cotton white ink and a 50-50. And of course, the surface itself, there's more molding or that may happen on the surface of a low bleed ink, or modeling, I guess it may be referred to, where you can actually see rough bumps and almost like little pockets and puff areas on a low bleed substrate or low bleed ink. A cotton white ink is just going to give you a smoother surface. 50-50 on 100% polyester. I have customers tell me they do it all the time and it works great. We don't recommend it. You will get burned by that practice. I absolutely suggest you try some of Rutland's Super Poly white ink and apply it to your 100% polyester garments. I assure you, you will be happy. It's a very good product. Nylon on a polyester, I just want to point out again, as I did earlier, nylon has no bleed resistance. So you do not have the option of applying a nylon ink to a poly garment, even though you're looking for that gloss or scuff resistance. You cannot apply it to a polyester substrate. And then polyester on cotton or 50-50. You know, poly inks are heavy. They have a harsh hand. I just wouldn't recommend applying it. Yes, they would ghost on a cotton substrate. I just wouldn't recommend applying a polyester ink to anything other than 100% polyester substrate. This is the end of the presentation. I appreciate your time. The sales rep here who supports the textile side of the business at Regional Supply out of Salt Lake, his name is Rob Nielsen. Rob's email address is here available to you. You can also visit Regional Supply online at www.regionalsupply.com. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.